The real Hans Christian Andersen. He wrote fairy tales to hide a scandal. Hans Christian Andersen didn't grow up with royalty, riches, or even basic comfort. He was born in a one-room house in Odense, Denmark, in 1805. His father was a poor shoemaker. His mother, a washerwoman who sometimes took her wages in alcohol. Theirs was not the world of grand fairy tales. It was the world of hunger, cold winters, and borrowed time. And yet, from a very young age, Hans seemed to believe, against all reason, that he was meant for something else, not just to survive, but to matter, to be remembered, and more than anything, to belong to the kind of world that would never have let a child like him be born in rags. As a boy, Hans had no friends. His limbs were too long, his voice too high, his imagination too strange. When the other boys went outside to play games or chase girls, Hans stayed inside, making dolls from scraps of cloth or staging plays with puppets he'd sewn himself. He read obsessively and mimicked the voices of actors he saw when, once in a blue moon, his father took him to the theater. He was strange, and he was lonely. But he was listening, watching, remembering. Every insult, every rejection, every tear he had to swallow because the world refused to see him. He stored it. And later, he'd turn it into stories. But not the kind you'd think. By the time he was 14, Hans left home for Copenhagen. Alone. No money. No plan. Just ambition so irrational it bordered on delusion. He begged his way into the Royal Danish Theatre, hoping to become an actor. But when his voice broke and the roles dried up, he was discarded. Just another strange boy chasing impossible dreams. Only he didn't go home. He refused to. And in his isolation, something broke open. A hunger. A rage. And from it, stories began to form. Stories about misunderstood outcasts. Stories about women cursed for being different. Stories about children lost in a world too cruel to be fair. They called them fairy tales. But they weren't really for children. Because underneath the magic, the swans, the talking tin soldiers and dancing slippers, there was something darker, something personal, something Hans didn't want to say out loud, but couldn't stop himself from writing. The Ugly Duckling? That was Hans. Mocked, ignored, rejected, until he transformed into something worthy of love. The Little Mermaid? That was Hans, too. Desperate to be part of a world that would never truly accept her, giving up her voice, her identity, for a love that would never be returned. And the Snow Queen? Cold, distant, emotionally unreachable, a reflection of the powerful, unattainable women Hans obsessed over his entire life. Because here's what most people don't know about the man behind the tales. Hans Christian Andersen was in love, constantly, desperately, but never reciprocated. And most of the time, not even appropriately. He fell for men who never returned his affections. He wrote letters to women he barely knew, pouring his soul into them, only to be met with silence or polite rejections. In his lifetime, he never married, never had a confirmed relationship. But his journals, his letters, and, most tellingly, his stories, reveal the truth he couldn't say out loud in the 1800s. Hans Christian Andersen lived his life trapped in a kind of romantic exile, and the fairy tales, they were his confessions. But there's more. Because one of those obsessions wasn't just unrequited, it was dangerous, and it almost destroyed him. It involved a real royal family, a forbidden connection, and a scandal so volatile, Hans had to bury the entire story beneath metaphor, myth, and a trail of ink that even his enemies didn't know how to read. Until now. Hans Christian Andersen had spent his life on the outside looking in. Not just into ballrooms and parlors, but into the hearts of people who never let him pass the front door. But there was one man who opened it, even if just for a moment, and it changed everything. His name was Edvard Collin, the son of Jonas Collin, the most powerful arts patron in Denmark, the man who got Hans into school, into literary circles, into the royal court itself. Without Jonas, Hans would have been another anonymous scribbler lost in the gutters of Copenhagen. And Jonas had a son, brilliant, charming, cold, and devastatingly unreachable. Edvard. Hans and Edvard met as boys but grew close as young men. They studied together, wrote to each other constantly. And from Hans's side, it wasn't just admiration, it was worship. Pages and pages of love letters, breathless, pleading, obsessive. Hans wrote things that no man would dare say to another man in that era, unless he was willing to lose everything. I long for you, yes. This longing consumes me. You are my first, my only. Hans to Edvard, 1835. But Edvard never returned the affection. In fact, Edvard got married to a woman, and Hans was invited to the wedding. He went. He wrote in his diary afterward that he was broken, that he felt like a ghost in a world that had no room for his kind of love, and that's when the stories began to change. Before Edvard, Hans wrote playful, quirky little tales with clever morals. But after Edvard, the stories got darker, more tragic, more personal. The Little Mermaid, for example, wasn't always about a girl losing her voice. Originally, it was about a creature who loved someone who could never love her back, and who paid for it with pain, silence, and ultimately, disappearance. Sound familiar? Hans rewrote his grief into myth. The mermaid giving up her world for legs? That was Hans, giving up his dignity for closeness. Her pain with every step? That was him, walking through society pretending to be normal. The prince falling in love with someone else? That was Edvard. And the foam. The mermaid turning into sea foam when she's finally completely invisible? That was Hans's worst fear. To be erased. But that wasn't the only story hiding a name. There was another, a quieter story, one that no one thought twice about. A story called The Shadow. On the surface, it's just a strange little tale. A learned man sends his shadow out into the world. Years later, the shadow returns, stronger, richer, more confident than the man himself. The shadow eventually takes over, kills the man, becomes him. People read it and thought, clever metaphor. But Hans knew exactly what he was doing, because in his letters around the same time, Hans began writing to someone else. Not Edvard, not a friend, a prince, specifically Prince Christian of Denmark. Now, most records paint this as a brief interaction, a writer meeting royalty. But the letters tell a different story. Hans became obsessed. He visited the palace as often as he could. He began describing Christian in poetic language, sometimes calling him a noble soul of unreachable beauty. Some biographers have dismissed it as typical Andersen drama. But when you compare the timeline of the stories, the deeper confessions begin to whisper louder. The shadow wasn't just a fable. It was Hans writing about himself, the poor boy who sent out his shadow to survive in the elite world. And the shadow thrived, became what he couldn't, took over, was loved by the prince. In one draft of the tale, which was never published, Hans even includes a line where the shadow lays beside the prince and whispers stories that only the heart could understand. That line? Removed before publication. Why? Because it was too close to the truth. You see, Hans was terrified of exposure, terrified of losing the little bit of access, of proximity, of connection he'd carved out through his talent. So he buried it, in metaphors, in mirrors, in stories. But one scandal, one rumor, almost ripped the mask off. It came in the form of a short article in a Copenhagen paper in 1847. The article never named names, but it hinted that a foreign storyteller had grown too familiar with royal affairs and should remember his place. Hans panicked. He canceled visits, stopped writing certain letters, and began editing his works even more carefully. Every word was weighed, every story trimmed to avoid suspicion. Because if the truth got out, if anyone truly understood what he was hiding in those tales, his entire career could collapse. And worse, he could be exiled, shamed, or worse. This was a time when men were imprisoned or institutionalized for less. But the truth had already leaked out. Into pages, into symbols, into swans and slippers and mermaids and silent little shadows that looked just enough like him to be forgotten. By the 1850s, Hans Christian Andersen wasn't just known, he was revered. His stories were translated into multiple languages. He was invited to salons across Europe. Royal families had his books sitting in gold-trimmed libraries. Children clutched his tales like treasures, and critics hailed him as the father of modern fairy tales. But behind the praise was a man still hiding, still obsessed, still rewriting his personal heartbreaks into fiction, and still playing a dangerous game of smoke and mirrors, where every story was a confession disguised as wonder. Because the more famous Hans got, the more he feared being seen. You might think someone who writes for a living wants to be understood, but Hans didn't want his readers to see him. He wanted them to see a mask, a beautifully illustrated, carefully crafted mask stitched with symbolism, metaphor, and coded heartbreak. And nothing shows that better than the story he wrote in 1843, a tale that nearly blew everything open. The Nightingale. On its surface, it's about a Chinese emperor who falls in love with the song of a simple bird, a nightingale. But when he's gifted a mechanical bird that can sing on command, he grows bored of the real one and lets it fly away. When the emperor falls ill and lies dying, it's not the artificial bird who saves him, but the real nightingale, who returns and sings him back to life. Sweet, right? Except here's what most readers missed. The emperor wasn't a fictional king. He was based on a real one. And the nightingale? That was Hans, the writer, the artist, the soul that offered something real, only to be discarded for something more socially acceptable, something mechanical. At the time, Hans had just returned from a disastrous stay with Charles Dickens, who initially admired him but ended up mocking him behind closed doors. Hans had overstayed his welcome, writing awkward notes and emotional letters. Dickens never responded. His family called Hans odd, clingy, and inappropriate. So Hans did what he always did. He didn't retaliate. He wrote, "In The Nightingale, the bird leaves without complaint. But when the emperor needs him, he comes back." It's how Hans wanted to be remembered. Not as someone bitter or rejected, but as someone noble. Unwanted but needed. And here's the twist no one talks about. Hans wrote a version of the ending that was far darker, one where the nightingale doesn't return, where the emperor dies alone, surrounded by mechanical praise and cold machines. But his publisher refused it, said it was too bleak, too revealing. So Hans softened the tale. Again, because every time he got too close to the truth, he blinked. But the real moment, the story that almost made everything unravel, came in 1844, with the publication of The Little Match Girl. A starving girl, alone on New Year's Eve, lights matches to keep warm. Each flame shows her a beautiful illusion, warmth, food, love. But when the matches run out, she freezes to death on the street. No one notices. No one helps. They find her in the morning, stiff, with a smile frozen on her face. It devastated readers. It brought Hans worldwide sympathy. They thought he was warning about poverty. But the truth, that story was Hans's most naked self-portrait. The little match girl wasn't just a poor child. She was the version of Hans that begged for connection, sparked moments of warmth with his stories, showed people glimpses of beauty, but always burned out alone, unseen, and unloved. Even the ending, where she dies with a smile, was Hans trying to convince himself that fading alone was somehow beautiful. And right now, if you're someone who sees past the glitter, past the fake smiles, past the layers we all put on just to make it through, then you're exactly who this story is for. And if you're still here, still listening, still feeling the pull of these hidden truths, then you're one of us. You belong with the people who know stories have power. So go ahead and like this video, subscribe to Uncle Luke Tells, and drop a comment if you've ever felt invisible and found your voice through someone else's story. You're not alone. Not now, not here. Back to Hans. By this point, he had the world fooled. He was a genius, a national treasure. But deep inside, he was still terrified that someone would figure it out, because he left clues. In The Red Shoes, a girl is cursed with shoes that make her dance until her legs bleed, a metaphor for obsession, for not being able to stop even when it hurts. For Hans, it was writing. He couldn't stop. Not when it exposed him, not when it cost him relationships, not even when it isolated him from the very world he wanted to belong to. He had become a prisoner of his own gift, and yet, he didn't stop. Because writing was the only place he could be honest. Even if no one noticed, even if every truth was wrapped in metaphor and pain. But by the 1860s, Hans was getting old, his health was failing, his fame was set in stone. And that's when he did something shocking. He began editing his legacy. He rewrote parts of older tales, burned some letters, and even asked that certain stories not be reprinted. It was the final act of a man who knew he couldn't erase the truth. But maybe, just maybe, he could blur it enough to survive history's gaze. As Hans Christian Andersen grew older, he didn't grow softer. He grew more careful, more guarded, and more determined than ever to control how the world would remember him. He knew death was coming. He'd been battling chronic illness, anxiety attacks, and long stretches of depression for years. And while the world still celebrated him as Denmark's literary jewel, he was haunted by something else entirely. What if they figured it out? What if someone read the stories too closely? What if they saw that the ugly duckling never became a swan, that he just died pretending? What if they understood that the shadows, the curses, the cold queens, and weeping mermaids, they weren't metaphors? They were memories? And so Hans took out his scissors, literally. In his final years, he became obsessed with paper cuttings. He made intricate, haunting little silhouettes, dancers with broken limbs, lovers kissing but never touching, women with knives hidden in their skirts. He'd give them to guests, giggling softly, pretending they were just crafts. But some of those cuttings matched characters in stories no one ever saw. The lost tales. Tales that didn't get published. Tales that were too honest. There was one about a boy who tries to steal the moon so he can bring it to the man he loves. But the moon is too heavy, and the boy breaks his spine under the weight. Another about a puppet who begs to be burned because he can't stand pretending anymore. And another, this one so disturbing that Hans himself tore it from his own journal, about a prince who falls in love with a swan. But when he kisses it, it turns to stone, and his lips are frozen shut forever. These stories didn't survive, not officially, but fragments remained in letters, notes, old drafts that scholars dismissed as too strange or unfinished. But they weren't unfinished. They were too real. Hans knew the power of what he was doing. He once wrote to a friend, "If I told the truth, they would burn my books and forget my name." So instead, he gave them lies wrapped in honesty, Or maybe it was honesty wrapped in lies. It didn't matter. He just wanted to be remembered, but not uncovered. And the person who pushed him to start rewriting his past more aggressively? King Christian IX of Denmark. Yes, the same royal family line that Hans had once flirted too closely with. By the late 1860s, Hans was often seen at royal dinners. He was considered safe, charming, even quaint. But behind closed doors there were whispers. Whispers that someone had found the older letters. That Edvard Collins' descendants had seen the pages Hans begged him to destroy. That maybe, just maybe, someone had finally understood what the fairy tales really meant. Hans panicked again. He started referring to himself in the third person in his diary as if creating distance. He began praising morality in stories he once designed to challenge it. And most tellingly, he rewrote a scene in The Snow Queen to soften the coldness of the titular woman, a character many believed to be based on a real Danish noblewoman he once obsessed over. Because the thing Hans feared the most wasn't poverty, obscurity, or even death. It was interpretation. He knew future generations would read his work, that critics would pore over every line. He wanted them to see genius, not desperation, brilliance, not confession. But the cracks showed. In 1872, Hans fell from his bed and never fully recovered. He spent the last 3 years of his life in a slow physical and emotional decline. He stopped writing. He stopped cutting paper. And he stopped pretending he was okay. He told one friend shortly before he died, "I am tired of being someone else." And when he finally passed in 1875, Denmark mourned. Bells rang. Statues were planned. Schools were named after him. And in the rush to sanctify him, they erased the very man he'd spent his life trying to hide. They made him a saint of childhood innocence, a storyteller for the young, a harmless old man with a gentle pen. They never realized they'd buried the real Hans Christian Andersen beneath the myths he carved for himself. And maybe that's what he wanted. But if you're still listening now, if you followed the trail through the glitter and the gloom, if you felt the pang of being unseen, unloved, misunderstood, then you know better. You know Hans Christian Andersen wasn't a gentle old man. He was a burning soul with no place to belong. He was a prisoner of etiquette and poetry, and he was a master at making you feel something real, without ever letting you see who was crying behind the curtain. But in his final unpublished words, found scribbled in the margin of a draft he never finished, Hans wrote something that no one ever included in the official biographies. Just 3 lines. "They read my stories, but they don't read me. I am the shadow, I am the foam, I am the match girl, and I am still waiting to be warm." Hans Christian Andersen didn't live long enough to see what would become of his stories. He died before the motion picture existed, before children wore princess costumes inspired by his characters, before massive publishing houses put his name on golden books filled with smiling mermaids and happy endings. He died not knowing that his stories, those desperate, coded messages, would become billion-dollar empires. And with that transformation came something he feared far more than being discovered, being sanitized. The world didn't just forget the real Hans. It erased him, rebranded him, bleached his grief and queerness into family-friendly animation. They took the pain and twisted it into sparkle. In 1989, Disney released The Little Mermaid, bright red hair, big blue eyes, songs about love, and a perfect kiss in the end. But there was no sea foam, no dagger, no quiet surrender, no heartbreak. The entire point of Hans's original story, that love sometimes doesn't love you back, and sometimes you disappear because the world has no place for you, was stripped, sanitized, for smiles, for box office, and kids cheered, parents bought the toys. Ariel became an icon of triumph, not sacrifice. And Hans? He was just a footnote, a name on the credits no one read. But the irony, the part no executive could erase, that behind every one of those stories was a man who had already been forced to live a fake version of himself. Hans knew what it meant to wear a mask. He wore one his entire life. And now, even in death, they put one on him again. He was marketed as the grandfather of innocence, a writer of bedtime stories for the morally pure. But that's not who he was. Hans Christian Andersen was a lonely boy who never felt like he belonged. A young man who loved people he couldn't touch. An artist who turned pain into parable, fear into fable, heartbreak into history. And the world buried that version of him. Until now. Because today, scholars are finally doing what Hans feared most, reading between the lines, digging into the margins, unearthing the letters, the subtext, the lost drafts. They're discovering that The Little Mermaid wasn't just a love story, it was a eulogy. That the Snow Queen wasn't just cold. She was a metaphor for the unreachable, for the emotional paralysis Hans felt when he tried to love someone who couldn't love him back. That the shadow wasn't some clever fantasy. It was Hans's confession that the man he had to become to survive wasn't the man he truly was. And that's where the real story lives, in the parts that scared him, in the drafts he burned, in the truths he tried to hide, not out of shame, but survival. Because back then, being honest could destroy you. And so, he wove his truth into stories children would carry for generations, hoping, just hoping, that someone would eventually see past the castles and clouds and understand what he was really saying. And now, you do. You know that Hans wasn't writing for applause. He was writing for rescue, for connection, for warmth, and maybe for someone, anyone, to say, I see you. So say it now. Say it for the boy with the scissors, for the man with the secrets, for the writer who built a kingdom out of silence. Say it for the part of you that's ever felt unseen. Say it loud. We see you, Hans. And now, we know.